All right, here we go with film history. It's chapter 10, and it involves quite a comprehensive look at history for an intro course, but we'll try to whittle it down a bit here on what's essential. So be sure and check the PowerPoint to help you with this. Early traces of development of moving images is really where they're starting with, which can reach way back into the 1890s as they start to develop a more comprehensive look at still photography and also think of ways to make more revenue from it. Style of film, technological aspects, and social developments in cinema from the 1890s to present day. And that's pretty important to see the track and how it developed and how long it took to create what you're enjoying today. There are 4 approaches to film history. Let's go through each one individually rather than listing them all and then going through them. The aesthetic approach is where the historical perspective is based on individual movies or directors, and that is a sense of how they've contributed to the film industry through artistic significance and influence. So that's where you'd pick out your favorite director, maybe even an actor, or the influence they've had on film and made it progress to a new level. Second one is technological. Many of us are fascinated by the use of CGI, but it reaches way before that on how they developed their first special effect, which was actually an accident, a jammed camera that created the first dissolve. And from that point on, they saw that there are ways of doing it manually and not through computers, of course, at first, because of the concept of how you design a shot, how you make something stand out, manipulating the content to create a technological advancement. And even sound was fitting into that area in the 1920s. So it focuses on the interaction of technology with art or the aesthetics, different types of production approaches, and economic factors where, yes, they're still trying to make a living at what they're doing. Economic approach, looking at history from the revenue perspective, how they've generated revenue from the very beginning of film and what was fascinating at first to compare to what you see as fascinating now, and tracking it through a movie studio, the independent period, all the historical aspects are gone through from that economic look at film. Social history. You may have heard of films influencing social trends, and you could go back to many and get that as an example. So that's the 4th approach. Social history of film, how it's tracked our culture, made changes to our culture, both good and bad, and how that influences the way we think about what's going on in the world. So movies have served as primary sources of studying society and sociology, thinking of religion, politics, culture, trends, and what we used to see as taboo compared to what you see as being unmentionable areas that should not be addressed in public. And it asks to an extent, if any, a particular movie has swayed public opinion or affected social change in some way. It could be as simple as the way people dress to their social, ethnic thinking process. It examines the complex interaction between a film and the social institution, and is kind of separated that way from other social institutions. So let's look at how film first developed. Starts with a photograph, and as this figure shows, at first the image in the camera was actually upside down through the mirror process, through the lenses, and it created that look. But when the picture was developed, of course, you could flip it and make it right side. So they saw photography as writing with light, and that led to how we feel about film today in that same aspect. So that was Sir John Herschel in 1839. Camera obscura was a Latin for a dark chamber, a location large enough for a viewer to stand inside it, the light entering through a tiny hole, then the ability to create an image from that. And then the most significant for film will be series photography, taking a number of shots in order, in other words, to reflect an action. Not moving yet as we know it, but still a series of shots that reflected an outcome of movement. Here's the one to actually Here's the one that we actually would look at as the most significant for this course, a milestone in photography where the wager was that a horse, when galloping, will at some point have all four legs off the ground, hooves off the ground, and how that would be. So first they create, of course, images that became negatives. That's not yet. Then the revolver photographic through 1874, a special photographic gun, and then the first series of photographs to show continuous motion, which is the horse galloping. And if you look at these images, where do you see any that show all four legs off the ground? And it happens pretty early. You've got this one where it's close, but this one, obviously all four are off, as is this one. So Edward Muybridge, 1877, put up about multiple number of cameras, 12 or so, to capture these images. Actually, this would make you think it's 16 all in a row, and capture the image to show how different it is when you look at things in a motion aspect. That, of course, made people work to create the first movies. The first one known is 1894, and that's important to note. The only one that they've been able to actually capture and preserve is Record of a Sneeze, simply a man sneezing 3-4 times in a row, but in continuous motion. All the frames acted together to create that sensation. In 1895, they start creating more actual images that captured reality. That's the Lumiere brothers in France, and they continue to show people on the everyday lives and what they're doing that captured and fascinated so many people. And then, as we've mentioned, Georges Méliès, the cinema's first narrative artist, where he actually created fantasy films based on storylines on a stage to show the impact of film. Black Maria is how I pronounce it, is a actual first known studio done by Thomas Edison, and it's captured and made it dark so they could capture the images better. And so very basic beginning of film in the 1890s. Significant is 1908 to 1927, the silent era, and that's when film takes on sound at the end of this era. And the idea is creating a narrative story through classic Hollywood style of storytelling that started to develop the system of film as we know it in the United States. Genres are developed during this period. Westerns were probably the most popular at this time because it captured our fascination and showed a lot of action. There were experiments with color and animation, and the color was based on attitude. So if you saw kind of a yellowish, almost sepia type color, that was romance. If it was red, it was violence. Blue, it was a cool atmosphere, maybe semi-romantic, but still you get the idea that colors represented moods. Feature-length films were very short, probably 15 minutes to a half hour, but before 1910 they started to stretch out until the Birth of a Nation actually went like 3 hours, and no one thought anyone would sit through a movie that long, but they did, and it started to show the potential of film. The movie director starts to take on the role as the central developer of a film, and Walt Disney makes his first cartoon in 1922, animated motion, mostly drawn, very little color, to start that trend in film as well. So here's the controversial one, Birth of a Nation, 1915. D.W. Griffith directs a movie that shows the birth of the Ku Klux Klan. They are seen as American heroes. They do some outrageous acts in the movie, including hanging an African American. And it stereotyped African Americans in what held for many, many years on their social trends, how they acted, that they were not intelligent, all the negative things you could think of for an ethnic display of one culture was accomplished in this film. So very negative, yet it did remarkable technological advancements to show how you could tell an effective story through editing and with action, even portrayed a historical moment of Kennedy Lincoln's assassination. African Americans protested the film. They picketed outside movie theaters that showed the film, and also showed that it could generate a social trend of protest against a movie because of its influence. Start that again with Birth of a Nation. Here's Birth of a Nation, 1915, a very controversial film, but a classic because of its technological use of film. D.W. Griffith was the director, showed his prejudice or ignorance towards America and its ethnic culture. It actually shows the birth of the Ku Klux Klan, made them American heroes, while stereotyping African Americans in a very negative way, and really impacted culture on how the Caucasians thought of African Americans for many, many years. So a great disservice to that ethnic area in the United States. African Americans would protest the film outside movie theaters, boycott those that showed it, and really showed that they weren't going to take that attitude. But it continued for much of this first period, where very few African Americans had the opportunity to act in film. They were all whites who put on blackface, which is another trend that showed how offensive it is to African Americans. Now we go into different world areas and I've whittled this down from your book a bit, so please think of this PowerPoint as being an opportunity to just study areas outlined and not the entire type of film exploration of the world. So from 1919 to 1931, German Expressionism is very significant in film. Not many shown in the United States, but kind of a horror genre approach. Very cynical, involves disillusionment in the system, alienation of a culture against each other. In other words, kind of a zombie look, showing horror, that there were terrible people out there that would walk and were almost invincible and were more bent on hurting people rather than helping. So distorted images, exaggerated settings, very fantastic images, and moving and subjective camera work, but very unique and significant to the development of film. French avant-garde went outside the norms of film, very surreal, anti-conventional, actually absurd at times, very psychological oriented, very long films for this time, like The Fall of the House of Usher, but the images are more fantastic than anything else. Then comes the Soviet Union in the 1920s. They developed their own Soviet montage movement, all based on all of us being equal, following the communist philosophy. Here are the important directors to note. I've mentioned Sergei Eisenstein before, Pudovkin, Kuleshov, all of them, Vertov, create, experiment, and try to manipulate images to affect the outcome to the viewer. So very significant use that way. And then A Man with the Movie Camera, 1929, showed how they could manipulate the image, where, of course, there isn't a little man sitting on the camera. It is a man on a tripod on a mound, but they were able to split the screen and create the impact through the montage effort. 1927, sound comes in, becomes Hollywood's golden age until the late 1940s. They've transitioned from silent to sound production. They've created a studio system that pushes actors and stars are formed. They exploit the familiar genres to make money. They develop their own production code, motion picture production code, where they would not allow certain actions by actors that might be looked as inappropriate. So very clean image, more standard film length of an hour and a half, less than 2 hours is the norm. The golden age is the cinematic style of Hollywood. You see the color coming in the late 1930s. The narrative approach and editing are increased in intensity to develop sound use to go with the images, and it becomes very innovative in the way they design shots, the cinematography capturing the images. Lighting is very sophisticated and studio controlled. Acting has a certain style and image that only reflects the positive, and then editing, of course, puts it all together into a much more traditional concept of film. The lighting is very sophisticated to create the shades needed. Makeup is necessary, but not like the early days, and the film stock is more advanced, allowing them to do darker image recording and bringing it out into a satisfying look. Black and white continues to be the main film type made, very little color. Only the fantastic, big epic type films would stick with color all the time, so that became a standard with most films being black and white, only the very high level films being color. Citizen Kane becomes the significant film of the history of film because of its message and how it not only advanced storytelling through technological use, but also artistic use. So it's a radical film that set and split people apart. They gave Orson Welles the opportunity to get into film when it had been very controlled. You could not just walk in and become part of the film industry. The complexity, though, of his use of sound made the difference. His sound design created realism, high degree of cinematic realism with the angle shot, the control of the black and white images, and the cast rehearsed for a month before shooting began, which was also very uncommon. So where did Orson Welles come from? He gains fame from the radio theater broadcasts he put together, and the most significant was War of the Worlds, War of the Worlds, which was also so realistic that created a panic in the United States. There was some evidence that some actually committed suicide or died because of the panic that Martians were invading the U.S., and all from a radio play. And the reason that happened was a very popular show on the NBC radio network. Charlie McCarthy ran over the top of the hour. They missed the first part of War of the Worlds, and that became a panic effort as people thought that it was really happening. And of course, deep focus photography we've talked about and made a significant difference in how films were created. In 1942, in Italy, the war is coming to an end for them, but they were very poor. They had to create their movies with unprofessional actors, non-professionals being offered the opportunity, more of a documentary, realistic style because they couldn't afford lightings, they didn't have good studios, so they had very long takes, very little dialogue, and the endings were kind of obscure. You couldn't really get a definite conclusion, very hard to find a climax, that type of thing. So it's very humanist, showing the poor staying poor, the rich getting richer, and the one that captures that element is The Bicycle Thieves, 1948. Vittorio De Sica directed, and it shows a young father trying to keep a job because unemployment's so high. Someone steals his bike. He goes and tries to recover it honestly. Cannot happen. So he finally is driven to steal a bike, but of course he gets caught and is lucky he doesn't go to jail. So that's kind of the attitude of Italian neorealism. Then in the late 50s, French New Wave comes in. They start to take on philosophical approaches. They call it cinema verite, which is truth film, using film to capture actual events or reenacting them in a very realistic way. So they saw this as more self-reflective and challenging how we thought of society. So the film to remember is The 400 Blows, a 1959 film from Francois Truffaut, which actually captures his youth, where he was abused by his parents, drove him to crime, was seen as a juvenile delinquent, and punished for his wrongdoings. Nothing went well for him in his early years. Germany starts to change its approach in the 1960s and their own new cinema movement. That's not as significant as the others either, so we're going to move on to a more significant area, which was Japan, and how it grew out of the World War II devastation that it experienced and really contributes significantly to films. And this is interesting. At first, Japanese films is influenced by great directors in the U.S. like John Ford, Howard Hawks, and Orson Welles. But then with the coming of Akira Kurosawa, he uses their topics for movies, and we in the United States start taking their storylines and developing it for our Western films. People start showing differences between Hong Kong and the People's Republic of China, realistic depictions of ordinary people. If you haven't heard some of their social control issues, they would say no couple could have more than one child, things like that. But out of this comes Ang Lee, who has influenced American film greatly and shared his culture through his own films, like Crouching Tiger and Hidden Dragon from 2000, showing the sensational use of film by him. But this is one to remember. Largest film industry in the world is in India, 1,200 features per year, even more documentaries than anyone else produces, which earned them the title of Bollywood. And from that, this new Indian cinema creates a different approach to making a film and making a profit from it. So India is very influential in the film industry. Now, new American cinema is very significant to us because of how we start to change in cinema from the mid-1960s on. We see very innovative and different ranges in styles. They adapt cinematic conventions that are new to the audience, all because of television's dominance. More sex is introduced, foul language, more violence, and the content is very much protagonistic, male and female. And this is where we're going to see females gain a more complex and substantial role in films during this period. So the plots become more complex. They have new storytelling techniques, and it becomes more complicated in understanding the storyline. So the woman, we're going to say, had a big influence on changing the women image in film is Faye Dunaway, and that is seen with her portrayal in Bonnie and Clyde in 1967. Very strong figure. She uses a gun. She commits acts of violence, shows her vulnerability, but becomes more human and brings women with her. Then in 1974, Roman Polanski does Chinatown, and she plays a woman who has been molested by her father. So incest is part of the plot, which was really taboo at that time. So all of this shows that the female fatale character is really coming into her own in film and becomes significant to the changes happening in American cinema as far as violence, sex, and other drug issues. So they become more stylistic in how they touch a film. They go to shooting on location rather than staying on the studio lot. They become experimental with sound design, using sound to change the mood, and they're more reliant on naturalistic or method acting rather than the standard traditional Hollywood star status. So all of that leads us to the end of chapter 10, and the final one will deal with technology, and we'll talk about that next time.